Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. There have been a few times where I've made cards and thought, okay, I think I may have nailed this one. And this is one of those cards. I'm really excited to share this with you. I love this card, and if you've been following me for a little while, then you know that I'm a really big Harry Potter fan, and I love making these themed cards. So I'm going to show you how I made this card. I used a card base and some white cardstock. For my background, I used this tree background by Lawn Fawn. I cut one whole one and then a few extra trees to make this background. And here I am just trimming this apart so that I can get these ready to use a bit later. Once they were done, I then used the piece of the Swish and Pop die set that kind of tells you how big you need the bottom part of your card front to be, if that makes sense, so that you can hide the entire mechanism. I actually cut that piece again a bit later because I made it a little bit too short, but we'll get there a bit later. So here I am playing with the pieces for this Swish and Pop die. I loved it. It wasn't really tricky at first, but it did take just a little bit of playing around to get the hang of. At first I thought I was going to have my image pop up from the right hand side, but the little deer I use a bit later was facing the opposite way and it just wasn't working. So I used that same die to puncture these little holes, and I just moved it across my cardstock to give me some more options on the other side, and then just flipped everything pretty much upside down so that I could use it on the other side. I really love that this is an option and that you can use the same dies. We don't need like a different left-handed die set for this. You can just flip things around and it does the exact same job. Here I am making my background. I love making magical backgrounds as it is, but when I do them for these theme cards, I feel like you have to go extra sparkly, extra magical, extra purple. So for this background, I'm using some Chip Sapphire at the top, which blends down into Dusty Concord, and my lightest colour is Seedless Preserve. I'm then going to sprinkle it with some water to lift off some of that colour. And then of course I'm going to go in with my watercolour pigments. This time I'm using white gold to give it a bit of a starry night sky feel. I just love that. This is probably my favourite combo for backgrounds. So here we are with everything over on the left hand side. And by now I have already recut that piece of cardstock so that it's a little bit bigger. Here I am lining everything up so that I can use this part of the die that is going to give me the space for my little pull tab. I really cannot fault this die set. It's perfect. I love that everything is already thought of. All the tricky bits like lining things up and puncturing these little holes, everything has been thought of really well. So this die set was actually very easy to use, which is good because I get intimidated by interactive dies and then I honestly just don't buy them, or I buy them with high hopes and then just give up because I need to make cards fairly quickly, and if they take too long and too much research, they kind of just get pushed to the back of my craft stash. To give this ground a little bit of texture because it looked really strange having it too flat, and I don't currently have any slimline dies that would probably work for a nice long ground like this, I just tore up the cardstock a little bit. And because I have a thing for rounding corners, this is the point where I rounded all my corners. So up until this point I've been using white pieces of cardstock for my little moving mechanism. And that was mostly just so that I could play with it and work out where everything needed to be. The piece that you pull is actually going to be dark grey to match my ground so that it blends in. And that white piece that swishes across, I'm actually going to use a piece of shrink plastic that I cut because it's really thick. It's so much thicker than acetate, and I was worried that a thin piece of acetate rubbing against the trees in the background might snag somewhere, so I thought if I go a nice thick piece, it can't get stuck onto anything. And it was super sturdy, and as you can see I layered that grey piece twice so that my cardstock was really nice and thick. And you'll see me play with the mechanism like 40,000 times in this video because I just couldn't believe how much fun it was. So to give my little ground here a bit more texture, I'm going in with some Black Soot Distress Oxide ink and just rubbing up the edges. I just didn't want it to look too plain. Adding little bits of texture like this for me just totally changes the feel of the card. Once I'm done with the edges, I'm then going to pop a little bit of this ink on my mat and water it down, and then I'm going to sprinkle that over the top. And then you guessed it, more watercolor pigments. But then to top this off, just for a little bit more dimension, make it look a little bit different, I then went over it with some white acrylic paint sprinkles as well. Now I'm finally going to start stamping. I really kind of just made this card up as I went. There wasn't really a plan. I knew the idea that I kind of wanted to show, but it really was just a matter of finding the pieces as I went and just really hoping it would all come together. I'm using the lake from the Swan Soiree set, and I'm stamping that with some mermaid ink. For my sentiment today, I thought this little sentiment from Pretty Pink Posh would be perfect. It reads, "You're braver than you believe," and I feel like that really suits this moment in the movie that I'm trying to recreate. I'm making sure I put lots of anti-static powder down before I stamp my embossing ink onto my cardstock and then covering it with white embossing powder. Once I had heat embossed that, I came back to my table and then decided that I would get the little Dementors done. I used the little ghost agenda by Mama Elephant for these. And it's funny because these little ghosts could not look any more harmless. They have the cutest little faces. So now back to those trees. Like I said, I didn't really have a plan for this, so I kind of jumped back and forth to try to make the whole scene come together in the end. So right now I'm just rounding off these little tree branches so that it looks a little bit more natural and like I didn't chop them all apart from each other. And then, just like my hands like to do, I slipped and snipped the tree, but luckily that bit's going to hang over the edge. For the trees where you're going to see the bottom of them, I'm just cutting them kind of in like a wavy line to make it look like, I guess, just the bottom of a tree, and like it's part of the ground. Now to move on to the adorable little Patronus that pops out from behind the trees. I'm using that mermaid ink again to stamp this one because the Patronus kind of has that really beautiful blue glow. Once that's stamped, I mix some of my Distress Oxide ink. I can't actually remember this colour. I think it's the peacock feathers because it's kind of the same bluish colour that the mermaid ink is. And I mixed it with some of my liquid stardust by Lawn Fawn. I'm just going to paint with my little paintbrush some of these areas so that they're kind of glowy blue with heaps of sparkle. After that, I'm then going to go over all the white areas of this little deer with my white Wink of Stella glitter pen, because I can't help but make everything ridiculously shiny. Now back to my little forest, jumping back again. I'm just using the excess ink off my black blending brush and I'm just rubbing it on the edges of these trees, just so that they're not stark white. It kind of looks like there's a little bit of shadow on the edges, but I mostly just didn't want it to look too bright. And look at that cute little Dementor in my hand. He is just so smiley. Okay, there we go. I have to play with the moving pieces again because I have zero self-control. And now I'm going to start using some of my Kids Adhesive Foam for my ground so that it gives a lot of space underneath for the mechanism to move freely. I love that this is adhesive on one side so that I could start peeling it off and sticking it in the right places immediately and start playing again with all the moving pieces to make sure that they don't bump into anything. I do 2 layers of this foam. One might have been enough because this stuff is pretty thick, but I really just wanted to make sure that this card is going to last and that maybe even if something presses down on the front for a little bit, it won't ruin everything, it won't squash anything, it's going to have plenty of room to move around. And so here I am just checking that all of those foam bits are going to be covered. And now back to my trees. So these 2 middle trees are actually going to be behind my ground so that it looks like the forest has a little bit of depth. So I'm just marking out the places that I think are going to be hidden and going to be trimmed. I had to make sure that these trees were glued down really well because any lifting on the edge of either of them would mean that my little deer would get stuck. So I'm just using some regular PVA glue to stick these down nicely on the background, making sure the bottom of the tree is hiding behind the ground. I just love the way these white trees look against that purple background. And then once again, playing with the moving pieces. This time at least I had a purpose. I was trying to make sure everything stuck down nicely. And this was the point in time where I trimmed off the excess pieces of tree hanging over the top. And I trimmed the excess bit of the pull tab as well. And just for good measure, a few more pulls of the pull tab to make sure it works. At this point I was super happy with how things were lining up. So I used some double-sided tape in a few different sizes to cover these pieces of foam so that I can stick my ground down, so that I can get working on what is going to be on top of the ground. Once I removed the backing to my double-sided tape, it was then time to glue the ground piece down and play with the moving mechanism. So for the back of the tree on the right hand side of this card, I'm again using some of the kids adhesive craft foam. I'm sticking it on the back where it's not going to interfere with the ground piece. And I'm putting a few little bits behind the branches too, just so all of this is super stable and that nothing is going to get bent or flop around, because there's a lot of dimension to this card. I don't want any pieces getting crushed. I've also got some marks on there so that I knew where the top of the card was going to be and where the ground was going to be, so that I wouldn't put any foam in those two spots. I then removed the backing to this and stuck it down. There was just a little gap here that I wasn't really happy with, so I stuck the tiniest bit of foam behind there and I glued the tree down to the ground. I then trimmed the excess from the top. Now it was time to adhere my little deer. So I used my tape runner that has that kind of semi-permanent tape until it has time to set, so that I could move this little guy up and down if I needed to and reposition him until I was happy. I then trimmed off the excess piece of this plastic so that you wouldn't see it. I then added some more adhesive and stuck him down and gave him some time to set. I noticed when I pulled him all the way across, he kind of hid a little bit behind the ground, and I didn't really like that. I wanted it to look more like he lands on the ground rather than slips behind it. So I just stuck a tiny piece of that foam behind the ground in black so that you couldn't even tell it was there. And now that's the perfect stopper, so he's not going to go too far across. To glue this tree down, this is probably the trickiest part. I used a piece of white cardstock behind the tree where the door is, because a big part of the back of this tree isn't going to be stuck down on anything. It's going to be the little pocket where the deer hides. So I did that so I could seal the door up and give it a little bit more stability. I then marked out where I thought I was going to cut this tree, and that gave me a bit of a guide as to where to stick this foam, so that it wouldn't interfere with my little guy moving around. I also noticed that he didn't touch this area, so I stuck some more foam down just so that I could make all of this as stable as possible, adhering as much of that tree down as I could. Once I felt like I had done as good as I could with that, I added some double-sided tape to the back of that foam and then adhered it into place. And just like the other tree, I glued the base of this one down to the ground. I then trimmed the excess of this tree off the top. Using some purple cardstock that kind of matched the background, I used some tape runner on that, and this is going to be the piece that covers my little pull tab and has a little arrow on it so that whoever receives the card knows to pull there. It was then time to stamp out my little Harry. I can't believe I left him to last. I was just so busy with all the other elements on this one. So once I stamped him out, I just kind of edited the image a little bit, using my erasable pen, putting on his little glasses, and trying to remember what he wore in this scene. I'm pretty sure it was like a grey-blue jacket. I know he had long pants on. I can't really remember, but I don't think I did too bad in the end. And then, of course, I put a little wand in his hand because he's the one casting the spell. I then coloured him in with a mix of Copics and alcohol markers. I didn't need to do much blending for him here because he is so tiny. It was then time to start properly setting my scene. I cut this rock from the Mermaid for You stamp set, kind of to give Harry something to stand on, and to just fill in this gap a little bit. It was looking a bit bare on this side. I then added some adhesive foam squares to my little lake to give that some dimension, and placed that on the front. I also gave Harry a little bit of dimension too. I wanted him to stand out. It was then time to adhere my little Dementors. They are so cute. For some of them, I used some PVA glue, and for others that I wanted to add dimension to, I used some foam squares. I just love these little guys so much. They really do not make scary characters. They have the funniest little faces. And the little ones that I put on the ground next to Harry have the sweetest smiles, not knowing they're about to be booted into oblivion by this little Patronus behind the tree. Look how happy that little guy looks down the bottom. He has no idea what's coming. Once they were all stuck down, I should have done this before, I usually do, but I was too distracted. I then added my double-sided tape to the back of the card front. Once I had done that, I removed the backing and adhered it all to my card base. At this point, I kind of felt like it was finished, but I also felt like it was missing just a little something. It kind of needed to be framed a little bit better. So from the same cardstock I used before, I cut some stitched leaves, and on my already purple cardstock, I also added a little bit of purple distress ink, just to change up the tone and make it not look so flat. You probably could have bet on it. I then added some sparkle to these two. I then glued them along the top of the trees just to make this have a bit more of a foresty feel. And as I said before, it just kind of framed it a little bit better. But the colours matched the background, so it didn't stand out too much or take away from the scene happening down the bottom. And there we have it, it's all done. What do you think of my very first card with the Swish and Pop pull tab set? I am personally very happy with it. I think it turned out really cute, and I can't wait to use this die set again soon. I'll leave you with some photos of the finished product. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't already, please subscribe. I'd love for you to stick around with me. Thank you so much for watching. Bye for now.